Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight. And thanks to Emily Fruscheski and the Washington County Heritage Center for their kind invitation to give this talk. As she mentioned, I'm Lonnie Lovness, and I'm here to tell you about a place I called home from the age of 6, just a few miles from here. There are many people involved, but the story revolves around just 3. My mother, Virginia, my father, Don, and Frank Lloyd Wright. Virginia was born in Michigan during the Depression and was given up by her mother. She came to live with an aunt and uncle in St. Paul, and through art scholarships was able to earn a degree at Hamline University. She also studied and taught at Rasmussen Business School. My father was raised near Como Park and became a chemical engineer, working for 3M, starting during college. He was a Navy flyer in World War II and a Golden Gloves boxer. He was a friend and sparring partner to Elmer Kid Violent Ray, a heavyweight contender in the late 1940s. My parents had a wide range of interests and were both adventurous throughout their lives. In describing them, I guess I'd say they didn't know it couldn't be done. In 1955, Don and Virginia were in their late 20s with 2 little girls. We lived in a 1-story block house, essentially a walkout basement, on the south side of White Bear Lake, purchased for a few $100s down on a contract for deed. My mother, the artist, was planning to expand the home. They had traveled around the Midwest, looking at Wright buildings, and Mother had a few of his books. She drew ideas for finishing the basement with a 2nd floor for her painting studio. She had made detailed plans for a remodel when a distant relative of my father's came to visit. He studied them and he said, "Oh, this is all very nice, but why don't we have Frank look it over?" The relative, Franz Aust, was a landscape architect and professor at the University of Wisconsin. He had known Frank Lloyd Wright for many years, and with his introduction, arrangements were made for my parents to visit Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin, where Frank would look over the plans. In June of 1955, Don and Virginia arrived at Taliesin on a rainy Saturday morning, having slept in their car that night since they couldn't afford a hotel. My mother remembers being very self-conscious waiting in the vestibule when Jean Masselink, Mr. Wright's assistant, came to get her. She was thinking how feeble her plans were, hardly worth the great man's consideration. She was a little awestruck as she sat down at his desk, but he was very kind and encouraging. Looking over the plans, he said, "You're something of an architect yourself." He studied the drawings and noted that her entryway would block the south light. As he continued, he was making notes and marks on her plan until finally my mother said, "But Mr. Wright, there's nothing left." He replied, "You're right. I guess we'll have to design a house for you. I suggest you sell this mess and start over. What can you get for it?" My mother lied and said it was worth $10,000. Mr. Wright scoffed, saying he designed houses for $50,000, $100,000, $500,000. But I think he was charmed by the young woman, and he finally agreed to design a $10,000 house. Mr. Wright then gave Mother a short tour of this home, explaining how it's important to own your own view, as they looked out over the distant hills from the cantilevered birdwalk. She was intrigued with the rock walls, the soaring ceilings, and the play of light through the clerestory windows. I think she completely fell in love with the idea of a Wright house after seeing Taliesin. My father was exploring the property while Mother spoke with Mr. Wright, and when their meeting ended, she introduced the 2 men. Mr. Wright sized up my father like a side of beef, feeling his muscles, and said, "I guess you're strong enough to build a home for your spunky little spouse." Then they discussed in general terms how the process would go, and Mr. Wright promised to design a home for them and a studio. There was no signature on a document, just a handshake. The only catch was they would have to find a suitable building lot, since their existing lot was too small. On the way home, they were dizzy with excitement, but more than a little daunted about everything that lay ahead. I think if they'd actually known the work that was in store for them over the next few years, they would have stopped then. They were able to find a buyer for the lake home quickly, but finding another site on water with the correct exposure, proper topography, and at least 10 acres was a challenge. Mother scanned the newspaper ads and piled us girls in the station wagon each day to look for property. They knew Catherine and Henry Van Meyer and briefly considered building on the property at Arcola. Late in the summer, after months of disappointment, they found a farmer who would sell them property on a small lake west of Stillwater. George Wielander offered a parcel on Woodpile Lake with 10 acres for $2,500. And in December, they made a down payment. It was a gently sloping oak savanna looking west toward the lake, and after Mr. Wright gave his approval, work on the design began. As winter arrived, they anxiously awaited building plans that would allow them to start in the spring. There was one false start, however, when the first plan they received was a Usonian automatic using decorative concrete blocks. Mr. Wright explained in a phone call, you can cast the blocks one summer and build the house the next year.
Yeah.
Mother, however, was emphatic. She wanted stone similar to what she'd seen at Taliesin. Uncharacteristically, Mr. Wright acquiesced, and at Taliesin West, at that winter, work began on the Lovness studio design. Then they asked several contractors for estimates, and only one would even bid on the unusual project for $80,000. Clearly, if it was going to be built, they would have to do it themselves. With snow still on the ground in March of 1956, tons of rough limestone from a quarry in Bolton across the St. Croix River were delivered to the building site just west of Stillwater. My parents had purchased a used two-room trailer that was hauled to the property, and it became our home for the next 2 years. We had a well-dug, strung wires from the road for electricity, and built a rough shed to store bags of cement. Our bathroom was an old outhouse, and our bathtub was a bucket or a dip in the lake. In April, construction began. The huge hearth in a Wright home is the center of the design, and that's where they started. With shovels and picks, my parents dug the foundation hole for the fireplace and mixed concrete in a box. Exhausted after just one day, they both wondered if they could go on. A few days later, when they began to lay the rough limestone, my father piled them on one on top of the other with a little mortar in between. Mother was appalled and told him the stones had to be dressed, shaped, and carefully placed. But we'll never finish, was his reply. And as they argued, Franz Aus drove up. He explained how to chisel rock, got them proper tools, and gave them enough encouragement to keep on going. They developed a routine. Dee, as we called our father, would mix mortar as the sun came up in the morning, leave for his job at 3 a.m., while Mother would lay rock and rake joints, racing to make progress before the mortar set up on its own. Returning from work, he would join her until dark, and chiseling and fitting more stone. Over the summer, they were able to build about half of the outer stone walls. Curious people would stop by regularly, some of them architecture students, along with many local farmers, who would see the stone columns and say, I thought they were building a house. My grandfather Lovness was a skeptic, who was sure the overhanging fireplace mantle would collapse as soon as the supports were removed. Braced with steel, my father knew it wouldn't, and he made sure to drive his point home by swinging a heavy maul at the concrete blocks holding it up, as my grandfather looked on in horror. The mantle stood, and still does today. The first summer, it was almost all rock and concrete block work. There was another responsibility as well, taking care of 2 little girls. We were always fed and clothed, of course, and baths were regular. If the lake was warm, we bathed there or in a bucket. Ty and I were good at amusing ourselves, and we helped when we could by collecting small stones to be used as rubble in the chimney void. When winter came, we house sat for friends, and my father used their garage to build furniture that Mr. Wright had designed for us. He cut and assembled while Mother sanded and stained. She also sewed cushions for the chairs and found a shocking pink velvet that must have appealed to her after a year of working in dirt and cement. She contacted Jean Masselink, who told her, "Mr. Wright never chooses something like that. He likes organic colors. Don't you want moss green or rust?" She replied, "No, I want shocking pink." A few days later, a telegram came from Jean. "Dear Virginia, you win. Shocking." It was good use of our winter downtime, but we were anxious to get back to work on the house. The snow was not completely gone in the spring when construction resumed at Woodpile Lake. That spring of 1957, my parents knew it would be a stretch to finish the house before winter, so there was a real push to make progress. As the stonework neared completion, the in-floor heat piping was installed. Steel piping was bent and welded in a maze across the gravel foundation. Then my father tested it well beyond what had been specified. Many tiny leaks were found, and they were painstakingly repaired. Then the piping was covered with concrete. In-floor heat was not new technology, but it was rare, and few people understood the technical aspects. My father's careful attention allowed that system to last 50 years before it needed any service. To make the finished floor layer, concrete was tinted red with iron oxide powder, then poured in sections. Getting a flat, smooth surface requires skill and experience, so an old German cement man was brought in to help. There were other ringers hired from time to time, like welders, cabinet makers, and roofers. With the floor in place, the wood framing began. The back of the house was rock, but the front, toward the lake, was mostly glass with thin vertical supports and a roof with a large flat span, unsupported for a much longer distance than a standard home, and with wide overhangs on the exterior. Truckloads of long custom-milled lumber came from Minneapolis, and the final shape of the house began to be revealed. A local roofing company, Burwald, applied the flat membranes, metal edging, and tar and gravel finish. Special effort was made to seal the places where windows rose from the lower roof to the upper roof and around the chimney. Unlike so many Wright homes, ours was rarely plagued with a leaky roof or windows. Because there was nothing standard about the house, windows were custom made, as were the large fixed glass panels and tall glass doors on the lake side. Inside, there was no plaster. Curiously, plastering was the one thing my father was unwilling to do. The walls, of course, were mostly stone, but in other areas were covered with wood paneling, and built-in cabinetry. Every part of the home was custom made. The patterned ceiling was tongue and groove cedar, divided by beams finished with ribbed grooves. It was a dark finish, and it was subtle but very interesting effect. Recessed lighting in the ceiling and valances was something many people had never seen. As fall approached, there was a race to get the structure enclosed. While Dee installed glass in the window frames, my mother was on a ladder applying creosote to the ceiling and window frames. My father had suggested creosote to Mr. Wright as a long-lasting alternative to varnish, and Mr. Wright enthusiastically approved the idea. The house smelled bad for a while, but it worked as a preservative. As they neared the finish line, a problem arose with the mitered glass corner windows. The plan called for vertical glass panels to meet at a 90-degree angle in the living room corners with no frame. It took several tries to get the glass aligned and properly sealed. This was unknown territory in glass sealing technology. Finally, the last glass panes were put in place as November winds blew snow in my father's face as he worked. There was still detail work to be done, but it was now a home. Ty and I cried as the old trailer was hauled away, but we were moving into a work of art. It had been a 2-year marathon, and when my parents visited Mr. Wright in Spring Green the following spring, they showed him photos. He had not been able to visit the site, but he was pleased with what he saw in the pictures. He was curious and asked, "What did it end up costing?" My mother had kept meticulous records, and when she told him the total was $18,000, or $2,000 under estimate, he laughed and he said, "You know, I've been practicing architecture for 60 years, and that's never happened to me." The reward for Mr. Wright for doing such a good job on the studio was plans for 3 more buildings. And although they were excited at that prospect, it would be 15 years before they built again. Meanwhile, there were details that needed attention as we got to know our new home. Decorative folding screens were created for the bedroom entryways. Lovely lighting stacks were built based on a design from the Theater at Taliesin. The yard and walkways got some attention, although a formal garden plan by Franz Aust was never built. We also got to meet our neighbors. A lady named Katie lived nearby, and she introduced herself one day by throwing landscaping rocks through the windows. My mother thought it was gunshots and called the sheriff, and then called my father at work before hiding in a bedroom with my younger sister, Ty. The deputies came and hauled drunken Katie away, just as Don arrived. Obviously concerned, he stormed in and grabbed my mother, saying, "They didn't get the mitered windows, did they?" As young girls, we weren't really aware that our home was different. But when we began school and friends would come to visit, they would comment about the unusual aspects of a Wright home. No one else had rock walls or a huge fireplace, and a flat roof was almost unknown. We had no doors except on the bathrooms. Our floor radiated warmth. Living in the country, Ty and I were separated from most of our school friends, and we didn't have many opportunities to spend time at their homes. Early in grade school, Ty's teacher arranged a tour of our Frank Lloyd Wright home for the class, and afterwards, Ty kept wondering when they would get to see the other children's homes. Although we knew it was different, it was our home, and we came to love it. During construction, there had been a lot of mail and telephone contact with Mr. Wright and the Taliesin people. If there were questions, they would call Wisconsin in the evening when the rates were lower, always station to station to save money. Mr. Wright would jokingly greet their calls with, "How much money do we have to spend today?" My mother was always amazed that whatever part of the house they were inquiring about, he seemed to have the plan in his head and could immediately answer. He took to calling my parents his do-it-yourself couple. Certainly other clients had put effort into building their homes to some degree, but I think my mother had charmed the old man. And my father began providing all kinds of 3M, free 3M items, like boxes of tape, duplicating machines, adhesives, and construction material. Don and Virginia got to know Mrs. Wright, Olga Vanna, and Jean Masselink, Mr. Wright's secretary, Wes Peters, Wright's son-in-law and chief draftsman, and many apprentices in the fellowship. They visited Spring Green often, and Taliesin Weston, Arizona as well, becoming true believers in Mr. Wright's ideas about architecture. Over many years, Don and Virginia became unofficial members of the Taliesin Fellowship, even having a dedicated apartment at Taliesin called the Lovness Suite. My mother became Mrs. Wright's co-hostess at Taliesin galas. Her instructions were to mingle and keep the conversation lively for both men and women. On occasion, Olga Vanna would chastise her, saying, "Virginia, you're having too much fun." In the summer, my sister Ty and I would take part in extravagant parties for children on the lake there. My father ingratiated himself to Taliesin by supplying everything from a 3M bow tying machine to a complete surplus stainless steel kitchen from 3M's headquarters. Mother was an accomplished seamstress, and in addition to sewing all the upholstery for our Wright design furniture, she adapted many gowns for Mrs. Wright that had originally come from the Banks Liquidator store in northeast Minneapolis. Our home became a sort of R&R for apprentices who needed a break from Taliesin for a few days. And other notable people from the world of architecture and design became friends, and my parents developed a reputation for expertise in Wright history, Oriental art, and pre-Columbian artifacts. Don was instrumental in saving rooms from the Francis Little home on Lake Minnetonka in the 1970s, meeting with Metropolitan Museum of Art principals to arrange for a sale, and encouraging the Minneapolis Institute of Art to save a hallway from the home. He also recreated concrete sprite figurines from Wright's 1912 Midway Gardens in Chicago, and built replicas of lost furniture from several other Wright homes. In 1975, 18 years after finishing their first home, the studio, they completed a second Wright home on the property, a design adapted from the Seth Peterson cottage near Lake Delton, Wisconsin. Their cottage was tiny, but just right for the two of them. They built it using leftover stone from a building at St. Thomas College, repurposed redwood from a water tank at the Greenbelt Brewery, and some interior furnishings from the Little House in Minnetonka. They moved there and used the original studio as a guest house. And for 10 years, that was the place my sister and her husband lived. My parents traveled extensively in retirement, and when my father passed away in 2001, Mother stayed in the cottage until the estate was sold in 2015. She passed away at the age of 93 in 2018 with a long and full life behind her. The Lovness estate now belongs to Ted and Debbie Muntz, who've done extensive renovations of both houses and added a third Wright-inspired building. In my book, I've included a chapter that details the renovation work with current photos of the property. I am so pleased to say that the Muntzes have done an excellent job preserving the homes and preparing them for future generations to appreciate. I'm also pleased I was able to create this book as a tribute to a dynamic duo who built 2 Wright homes and enjoyed a full life of art and architecture. I'm grateful I was able to grow up in a Franklin Wright home, an experience that has shaped all my attitudes about life. Thank you.